Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at ianmasters.com. And joining us now is Kristen Breitweiser, who's a 9/11 widow and activist. She's known for pressuring Washington to provide a public accounting of what went wrong on the morning of September the 11th and in the months leading up to it. She testified before the Joint Inquiry of Congress in September 2002 and the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee in August of 2004 with regard to national security reforms. Her article, The Long-Hidden Saudi 9/11 Trail, was recently published by consortiumnews.com. Welcome to Background Briefing, Kristen Breitweiser.
Thanks for having me.
And it does seem that the much-anticipated, it's been called 28 pages. You mentioned it as 29 pages since it's now being declassified. There's been a lot of anticipation, but the extraordinary thing is that the groundwork was laid to try and marginalize the impact by a number of administration officials and former members of the original 9/11 Commission. Others went forth and said these pages are very important. But, of course, then they get released on the day when you've got a massacre in Nice, a coup in Turkey, and the fantastic antics of Donald Trump. So do you feel that they've been successful? They didn't want to do the 9/11 Commission in the first place. You forced them into it. You and your colleagues forced them into it. They didn't want to release these 28 pages, but they managed to release them under circumstances where they mitigated the impact as much as possible. Am I being conspiratorial here, or do you agree with that?
No, I think it's very accurate. The reality is they obviously didn't know about the Nice attacks or the coup in Turkey. But they did know that Congress was leaving for their summer break. And so to release these documents, at 2 o'clock on the Friday, just before Congress is leaving for a 2-month break, sort of, I think speaks for itself and how the administration wanted these documents to be seen and heard by Congress and the American public.
But what's extraordinary about it is that the people that, like Congressman Hamilton and others, who tried to marginalize these pages before they were released, saying that there's really nothing in them, they were just sort of sketchy preliminary investigations. If you read the earlier release, the raw field notes, and the subsequent pages that were just declassified, what is really clear there is that this is a roadmap to investigate a number of Saudi connections to 9/11. And the point that's being missed here is that this was a roadmap to a path not taken. They're lying when they're saying that these are just early sort of notes. The point is that they were very clear. Basically, this is an extremely clear dossier on all of the leads. And the point is, and I can't emphasize this as much as I wish I could, these were leads not taken. None of these leads in this report were tracked down. There was a complete block at the top. Do not investigate Saudi Arabia. So there's where the big lie is.
I think, you're correct. But what you also need to remember is that these leads were not investigated or followed up on in 2002, but they were also not investigated or followed up on prior to the 9/11 attacks. A lot of the information that's discussed in the pages is information that was, coming forward in 99 and 2000. And so because there was this standing order to not, investigate the Saudis, that the Saudis were, quote, hands off, it's arguable to say that the 9/11 attacks would have been prevented had Saudi not been considered an ally before the 9/11 attacks. And then what's even more upsetting is to find out that even after the 9/11 attacks, the Saudis weren't investigated because they were, quote unquote, deemed an ally. So, when you have people like Lee Hamilton or John Brennan or whomever else, Phil Zellico, saying that there's no there, that this was all raw data and there's nothing new, they're covering, with all due respect, their own asses. The reality is when you read these pages and you look at the information, we should have done something about what we learned. We should have, in my opinion, deemed Saudi Arabia a state sponsor of terrorism, because you can't draw any other conclusion than that when you read the information in the pages. And the fact that we didn't do that, the fact that we went to war in Iraq, the fact that 15 years later we're still spouting the company line that the Saudis are our friends, I think is a huge problem when people read those pages and say, wait a minute, these people sponsored several of the hijackers, God knows how many other of the hijackers. Not only did they do that, but our government, didn't, fell flat-footed in investigating them and covered it up for 15 years. And on top of it all, took us to war in a country that had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11, broke privacy rights, tortured, does drone hits, does everything under the sun, increases surveillance, wiretapping, what have you, when completely ignores the actual evidence of the people that perpetrated the crime or aided and abetted those who perpetrated the crime. And that, to me, is what is so alarming and so disturbing, that the American public is not going to learn that.
And again, I'm speaking with Kristen Breitweiser, who's a 9/11 widow and activist who is known for pressuring Washington to provide a public accounting of what went wrong on the morning of September the 11th and in the months leading up to it. She testified before the Joint Inquiry of Congress in September 2002 and the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee in August 2004 with regard to national security reforms, and her article, The Long-Hidden Saudi 9/11 Trail, was recently published on consortiumnews.com. And the pages are embedded in that article, aren't they, for people who want to read the actual pages?
Yeah.
So they can get them from your article at Consortium News, or there are many other places available, right?
Absolutely. You can get them in the article, but also if you just Google it online, they are available. And I get it. Listen, for someone who's not so inside baseball, it can seem like a little dizzying to read all the information, but it is very easy to glean an understanding that the Saudis are not our friends, and that had they been adequately investigated both before and after 9/11, number one, the 9/11 attacks would very likely have been prevented, and number two, they would not be considered an ally this very day.
Well, that's even more of a smoking gun, isn't it, than the idea that there was some Saudi complicity in 9/11, which has been covered up. The fact that had these leads that are in these pages and in the earlier release of documents, had they been followed up, 9/11 itself could have been prevented. And as you point out, Tamari, the Saudi consulate here in Los Angeles, who was subsequently deported because of his ties to al-Qaeda, he helped bring in Khalid bin Attash into the United States in June of 2000. That's, of course, before 9/11, to meet with these two 9/11 hijackers, Midar and Hazmi, who flew into the Pentagon. Tamari escorted bin Attash, who is a known al-Qaeda operative, through immigration and customs at Los Angeles International Airport, evading security and any possible alarm bells. Again, this was information that's in these reports. So what happens is that Khalid bin Attash met with these two hijackers in Los Angeles, and the USS Cole was bombed and 17 U.S. sailors were killed, and Khalid bin Attash, Midar, and Hamzi were all named as co-conspirators in the bombing of the U.S. Cole, which took place 9 months before the 9/11 attacks. So I don't know whether you talked to Ali Soufan and some of the people that tracked this stuff down, but how did we miss this? This is criminal.
That's exactly it. And I think what needs to be kept in context is the fact that during the commission's testimony of the Clinton administration transition to the Bush administration, you had certain officials saying that, we didn't have the actionable intelligence. We didn't have the actionable intelligence. And the reality is the USS Cole was the actionable intelligence. You had 17 sailors dying. And I think one of the key problems is that everyone needs to remember is Phil Zelikow, the staff director from the 9/11 Commission, who blocked the investigation into the Saudis, who rewrote entire sections of the 9/11 Commission report to appear to be more friendly to the Saudis, to quote-unquote exonerate the Saudis, which is the company line, happened to be on the Bush-Clinton transition team for the National Security Council. So if you want to look at someone who failed to understand the threat that was present inside the country in those transition months, you'd look to Phil Zelikow, because it would be his failure to adequately brief the incoming administration and make sure that quote-unquote actionable intelligence about those three hijackers in California in June of 2000, who thereafter committed the Cole bombing or were co-conspirators in the Cole bombing, were still embedded inside the United States, still receiving enormous support, both financially and operationally, and that they needed to be taken seriously. Yet Phil Zelikow apparently didn't transmit that message to the incoming administration. And so you had a Condi Rice who, had no idea, and you have 9 months of an administration where you've got these hijackers swarming all over the country, receiving all kinds of support, and not being investigated.
Right, and support from the Saudi ambassador, Bandar bin Sultan, who's close to the Bush family, often referred to as Bandar Bush, and his wife, of course, who gave $75,000 for these hijackers, for their upkeep and money that was clearly spent on learning to take off but not land jumbo jets. So, and then when you talk about Phil Zelikow, of course, he headed up the 9/11 Commission, which the Bush administration did not want to have. It's the work that you, Kristen Breitweiser, and others did that forced their hand into doing it, and they vilified you at the time, I recall, for even calling for such an inquiry. But Zelikow clearly treated Condoleezza Rice with kid gloves, where she airily dismissed the pleas from the head of the CIA and the head of counterterrorism and the memo that said bin Laden determined to strike in the United States. And lo and behold, who does Zelikow end up working for after the 9/11 Commission report is done? Condoleezza Rice. Coincidence?
It's unbelievable. I think one of the things that's not well known in the public eye, though, look, everybody wants to blame the Bush administration, but the reality is the Clinton administration was also reticent to investigate the Saudis. And I think John O'Neill, who's, since passed away, was killed on 9/11, would say that if he were alive today. And, and then the Bush administration came in, and because of the cozy relationship between the Bushes and the Saudis, it got even worse. They were completely hands off. And even to this day, you've got the Obama administration blocking the release of the 28 pages, blocking our ability to hold the Saudis accountable. So you know what? This is not just a Bush administration problem. It actually spans the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations. It's a pervasive problem. And we need to, as a nation, reassess why our administrations consecutively continue to consider the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia our ally when they are clearly not our ally. And I want to say one other thing that's not really well known is that Zelikow got on the commission through a recommendation, and this is what I've been told, from Lee Hamilton, which, it's nice to consider Phil Zelikow, who was put there to clean up the whole thing for the Republicans or the Bush administration or Condi Rice or Dick Cheney or whomever. But the reality is, from what I was told, Zelikow was recommended to the commission by Congressman Lee Hamilton.
Well, there you have Tweedledum and Tweedledee in each other's pockets. I mean, this is the permanent government at work here. But why is it, though, at the highest levels, particularly with the FBI Director Mueller and others, and I talked to Senator Bob Graham at length, and he told me that, he got visits from the FBI saying, drop this, you're delusional.
Enormous pressure. And that's the other thing that you have to realize. The 29 or 28 pages that you're looking at, I keep calling it the 29 pages because that's what the Obama administration told me, that it was actually 29 pages. But what you need to remember is that when this information was written, there was an incredible amount of pressure on behalf of the Bush administration and the FBI for Eleanor Hill and her investigators to not look into this matter. And that's so striking, is that even with that pressure, even with that failure to provide documents, purposeful, withholding of information, they still came out with 29 pages. 29 pages, not discussing Iraq, not discussing Iran, not North Korea, discussing Saudi Arabia. 29 full pages of a congressional inquiries report that was solely to investigate the 9/11 attacks. To me, that is astounding. To me, no one is discussing this in the mainstream media is appalling. And I think as a country, we really need to read these pages and force our government to call Saudi Arabia what they are. And they are not our ally. They are a state sponsor of terrorism.
Again, Kristen Breitweiser, 9/11 widow activist, known for pressuring Washington to provide the public accounting of what went wrong on the morning of 9/11, and she's testified before a number of congressional and Senate committees and about 9/11, and she has an article at consortiumnews.com, The Long Hidden Saudi 9/11 Trail. So when you talk about John O'Neill, I mean, talk about a hero. He was the institutional memory within the FBI. He knew more about al-Qaeda than anybody. And he butted heads with Louis Freeh, who eventually forced him out. And ironically, he got a job as head of security at the Twin Towers, and of course was killed on 9/11. Again, that gets to how's the fix in at this highest level? How do the Louis Freehs of the world, who tells them that you just can't go there vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia?
Well, my last understanding of Louis Freeh is that he's working for the Saudis. I mean, I might be wrong about that, but that's what I've been recently told, that he's currently employed by the Saudis. So
isn't that what happens?
How that works.
Isn't that what happens? Every senior State Department,
I guess that's how it works, right? I mean, I don't know. I'm not,
Well, everybody that I know, senior CIA people, they leave the agency, they get an offer to work for some Saudi bank, whether it exists or not. And the same was in state, and the same in defense. I mean, that's how they operate. They don't have a lobby like the Israelis do with AIPAC that deals with Congress and influences politics. They have a lobby that buys our top officials in the executive branch.
I think that's exactly it. And State Department officials, former State Department officials. Look, I wrote up a whole article on Saudi influence and how they buy and bribe their way through Washington, and it's disgusting. I mean, there's no other way to say it. It's just the fact that they know that greed is rampant in Washington, and ex-officials are more than happy to receive a huge chunk of change to look the other way and to not, say anything. And it's, like I said, I find it reprehensible.
But what do you think, Sultan, for example, the friend of the Bush family, and we know that after the first Gulf War, almost the entire Bush family went over to celebrate with the Saudis the defeat and containment of Saddam Hussein, and they were each given a bag of jewels, between $5 and $10 billion worth. We know there's always been a close connection, but since Bandar and his wife appear to have had a major role in this 9/11 planning, I mean, we don't know who found these 9 guys in the Wahhabi area in the middle of nowhere in the desert. They were ill-educated, if anything. They couldn't speak English. Who recruited them? Who put them on the planes? None of that stuff is really known. But if you accept the idea that there are Saudi fingerprints on this, and this wasn't some random act put together by some guy in Hamburg, but this was, in effect, a well-executed intelligence operation, if you accept that premise, then you have to ask yourself, if Bandar was involved or other senior Saudis, we know the consular officials and others were certainly involved. What do they think of us that we've let them get away with it? I mean, to me, it's double jeopardy.
Look, I think that the reason what they think of it is that it's business as usual. I mean, for years, when you look into the relationship of U.S.-Saudi, work together, you find that the Saudis fund a lot of the off-the-books forays of the CIA. The Saudis buy nearly $100 billion worth of weapons from our defense contractors. We buy oil from the Saudis. I mean, there is an entrenched relationship there, and I think the Saudis know that they pay Americans well enough to know that they're not going to have a problem, which is why for 15 years they sat on their laurels. I mean, there's a reason why Bandar, waltzed out of the White House in 2002 or 2003, I can't remember, and said, release the pages, we're fine with that. And President Bush said, no, we're not going to release the pages. And he said that because he knew that they'd never get released. So, that's the kind of cozy relationship that exists. They're very confident that the Washington establishment is not going to allow any sort of incriminating evidence to get anywhere, any sort of accountability to be assigned to them for the 9/11 attacks, because they've bought and paid for that influence.
But the 9/11 attacks, as hideous as they were and as traumatic as they were for the United States, they pale by comparison to the damage that's been done globally by the Wahhabi sect of Islam, which has a compact with the Saudi royal family. They have used endless amounts of petrodollars to spread their reactionary, violently anti-Western ideology around the world, and there are absolutely undeniable results of the poisoning and radicalization of Islam by the Wahhabis, to name a few: Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, the Taliban, Daesh, the Islamic State. The list goes on. They've destabilized Pakistan. And furthermore, the more you look at Saudi Arabia itself, I don't know whether you saw the recent Frontline hidden camera expose, it is the most repressive country in the world. I mean, women in North Korea have a better deal than they have in Saudi Arabia. And you're now you understand where, the 9/11 family's frustration comes from. Right. I mean, that's exactly it. It's because our government is not willing to hold them accountable, they get a pass. They get a pass for conducting mayhem around the world. Yes, they have the world's worst repressive place for women in particular to live. Their idea of justice is you chop people's heads off. I mean, it's documented, it's well-founded, and yet our government, we're supposed to be a shining example around the world, just looks the other way. And it's reprehensible. And, as someone who has spent 15 years fighting Washington to try to get the Saudis held accountable, you cannot comprehend how frustrating it is. You can't understand how frustrating it is to have a Secretary of State of my country submit a brief to a court saying that the 9/11 family should not be able to hold the Saudis accountable. The Secretary of State, I'm sorry, I thought the Secretary of State worked for U.S. citizens, not for foreign governments. Yet, go ahead and read it. You'll see that a brief was submitted on behalf of the U.S. Secretary of State stating that the case should be dismissed, the Saudis should not be held accountable. I find that reprehensible, particularly when that same Secretary of State has a WikiLeaks cable out there saying that, everybody knows the Saudis are the number one funder of extremists. But yet, that's what it is. And that's what, the 9/11 families have had to learn to deal with. Well, just in closing, Kristen Breitweiser, we're in an era now where it does seem, to put it bluntly, the natives are restless, politically speaking. We've had the surprising Brexit vote in the UK, and there's even a possibility that Donald Trump could become President of the United States. So there's a lot of anger and disquiet out there, and the political classes have failed many people. And Bernie Sanders on the left has gathered support, and Trump on the right. So I think there's a pervasive feeling that our government doesn't serve us. And here you have the most prime example of that with the cover-up of the Saudi involvement in 9/11. I mean, when do you think the people are going to rise up in this country? Because we fought a civil war in this country over slavery. This country that we are in blind support of, even though they have stabbed us in the back in the most heinous way, it's a slave country. Do you realize that almost half of the population of Saudi Arabia are slaves? And yet, we're in bed with these people. There's nothing good to be said about this regime. And frankly, I talk to Saudi dissidents a lot, and the young people in Saudi Arabia want to get rid of this horrible regime. They hate the mutawin, the religious police. It's not like I'm demonizing the people of Saudi Arabia, but the government is disgusting, and our relationship with this government is even more disgusting.
I think, in the article I wrote, I said it's like an addiction to heroin. It's rotting us from the core, and there's no explanation for it. But if you ask certain individuals in Washington, who are those individuals who make the decisions about this country's foreign policy, they will tell you square in the face that the Saudis are allies. On Thursday afternoon, the House had a subcommittee hearing, and a State Department official, the Undersecretary for Near Eastern Affairs, testified on Thursday, the day before the release of the 29 pages, that she had read the pages and that the Saudis, to this day, are our ally. Now, how any official could read those pages, read the information therein that talks about direct funding of the hijackers, laundering of money, all kinds of operational and financial support to just two of the 9/11 hijackers, and could then under oath swear that the Saudis are our ally. It's just inconceivable. And yet they do it. They get away with it year in and year out.
Well, let's hope that our next conversation is not about them getting away with it.
I just want to say that in them getting away with it, they not only leave Americans, but the rest of the world unsafe. I mean, that's the be-all, end-all. My husband's never coming back. Like, he's gone. But what concerns me is that the U.S.'s failure to hold the Saudis accountable, either for 9/11 or for their funding of groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Al-Nusra and everything else, causes the rest of the world to be unstable and unsafe. And innocent people continue to die. The whole reason the other widows and myself started this was so that no one else would ever have to walk in our shoes. We didn't want any other wife, mother, or child to have to witness their loved one getting blown up. And, that's what is so just difficult for us to understand, that 15 years later, I turn on the news and I see the attacks in Paris. I see them in Brussels. I see them in San Bernardino. I see them in Orlando. I see them in Nice. And it's heartbreaking because these people don't need to die. And if the United States would be the shining example that it professes to be, they would put an end to it.
I appreciate you joining us today, Kristen Breitweiser.
Thanks for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Kristen Breitweiser, who's a 9/11 widow and activist. She's known for pressuring Washington to provide a public accounting of what went wrong on the morning of September the 11th and in the months leading up to it. She testified before the Joint Inquiry of Congress in September of 2002 and the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee in August of 2004 with regard to national security reforms. Her article, The Long Hidden Saudi 9/11 Trail, was recently published on consortiumnews.com.
It's the same thing with the 28 pages. They haven't tried to rebut the 28 pages. They haven't put out any kind of detailed précis. All they are hoping is the public will grow tired, will move on, and business as usual can continue. This is just what's going on here.
Yeah. Well, and the real problem here is it's kind of like the big lie, where the true story of what's going on here is so outrageous that it makes you, Daniel Lazaire, sound like you're worse than some ridiculous illiterate birther who thinks that Obama is a secret Muslim Kenyan secret agent sent here by Osama to usurp McCain's rightful throne and reduce us all under Sharia law or whatever, because the truth is, yeah, he is guilty of high treason. And he has been for 4 years straight now. America's on the side of the butchers of New York City. Obama and his entire administration, going back to the first term, including Hillary Clinton, the current, nominee, basically de facto nominee for the Democratic Party nomination for the presidency this year. That's what it is. They've been knowingly backing the American people's sworn enemies.
I quite agree. 3,000 people died in 2000 on 9/11, and the U.S. Responded by trying to patch up relations with Saudi Arabia, trying to cover up who was really responsible. 2 days later, George Bush was photographed smoking cigars on the White House balcony with Bandar bin Sultan, who is actually named in the 28 pages. Who was the Saudi ambassador at the time, and was so close to the Bush family that he was nicknamed Bandar Bush. The contacts are numerous, and there's no question the U.S. was providing Saudis high-level protection at the time. And their instinct was not to get to the bottom of the crime, not to try to figure out why 3,000 Americans were killed, but to protect their relations with the Saudis. That was their first goal, their highest goal, and that's been it ever since through a Republican and Democratic administrations. And if Hillary is elected, it'll be the same thing, believe me.
Yeah. All right. Well, so now we got to take a big tangent over here onto the 28 pages for a minute, Daniel. You actually hold the world record for my favorite article about the Saudis and 9/11, at least up until the last couple of weeks, or in fact the last week. Because my wife just published her analysis of the 28 pages at
I saw that. I saw the article. It was excellent. Excellent article.
Yeah. And, Yeah, I hope everyone will read that. It's called The 28 Pages Explained. It's at antiwar.com. It's also on my site. And yeah, she really breaks it down, and she helped produce the documentary Press for Truth back when with Ray Nowaleski, and really knows her stuff there. But you have this article about Moussaoui, or at least that's kind of how it starts, I guess. And he was supposedly the 20th hijacker, although that was really Katani, right? But he was here. Al Qaeda had him here for something, and he was prosecuted. He was the guy who was learning how to fly but didn't want to know how to take off or land in Minneapolis, and Colleen Rowley and her FBI crew could have traced him directly to the 9/11 hijackers if only their FBI supervisors had allowed them to pursue the case and go to court for a FISA warrant, etc. And Colleen Rowley has talked about that on this show. But anyway, he gave a deposition in a lawsuit about, accusing the Saudis, over their role in this. Now the 28 pages have finally been released, and we've even got Larissa's, thorough take on every bit of it. And so, but what does it mean? We know for a fact that the guys who were handling at least some of the hijackers in the country, the Flight 77 cell, basically, the San Diego cell, that they were Saudi intelligence officers who were handling these hijackers. Now, it doesn't really prove, the 28 pages don't really prove that the Saudi embassy or Saudi intelligence or Bandar, these guys were actually running the operation itself, I don't think. But with all the other context that you have from your other work, and now with the 28 pages, just what, let me add one more thing. Richard Clark, ever since the second Rich Bleed podcast, and now in a new article that he's written for ABC News, he says what he thinks was going on was CIA was using Saudi to recruit these guys as double agents, but then the operation fell apart, never did happen, but then they still didn't tell the FBI about the guys in the country, and that was until August anyway. And, Ali Soufan and them say that the reason for that is because the San Diego cell were present, two or the three of them anyway, were present at the Malaysia meeting where the Cole attack was also planned. So if CIA had fessed up to the FBI that these guys are in the country, but we didn't tell you anything about it, at that point, they would have been kind of admitting their own culpability in not forwarding on this information sooner in a way where maybe it could have prevented the Cole from being bombed. So they just, quashed it, sat on it, whatever. But that doesn't satisfy me, Daniel Lazare. So now that I've asked you a 10-minute long question, I want you to give me a 20-minute long answer about why was Saudi intelligence doing what they were doing in the run-up to 9/11? Why were they allowed to get away with it? Is it as simple as some inside job, or was some kind of recruitment attempt that failed, or what?
Well, first of all, Scott, I have no secret information. I'm not privy to what's going on there. I just know I have a few general ideas as to what happens in Saudi Arabia and how the country works. There's two things to keep in mind. One is the country is immensely rich. It's got lots and lots of money sloshing around. Number two, when we talk about the Saudi government, we have to be very careful what we mean by that term. The Saudi government consists of a royal family with something like 7,000 princes. Now, the princes don't all rule. Rather, a very small knot of very high-level princes conducts policy. But the system is extremely porous. Each high-ranking prince has its own little, network of supporters and favorites and clients, etc. Money flows through 1,000 different channels. There's no central accounting and no clear demarcation between public and private funds. That's very important. So I would call the whole system corrupt, except that corruption, the word corrupt implies there are some rules as to how money should be dispersed. But there really are no rules. It's all a great big inside family, and money just sort of moves along this, a multitude of channels. And the Saudis also practice what on Wall Street is called a hedge. That is, they'll do one thing, but they'll channel money off into the opposite policy in case the first strategy goes awry. So therefore, they had their relations with bin Laden had gone downhill. They weren't getting along. Bin Laden had left the country. But they didn't want to break relations entirely. So they made deals with bin Laden. They funneled him money to keep him quiet. And they also funneled him money telling him that, sure, go off and make trouble. Just don't make trouble at home. So for a while, that seemed to work. Bin Laden did go off and make trouble. In fact, he made trouble in the United States, in which point all hell broke loose. But the point is that they have a lot of money going in a lot of different directions. They have a lot of people doing a lot of things. Many of them are tied up with the Wahhabist religious ulema or mullahs who are deeply devoted to a modern ideology of jihad, who view the West in extremely hostile terms. So there are some jihadis on the royal payroll. Some of them were in the U.S. Some were out to do sort of really bad things, and the royal family just didn't want to know about it. Because as long as these people didn't make trouble in their own backyard, they figured it would be okay. So I think that's kind of the framework in which we should try to understand what the 28 pages is about. They describe a multitude of contacts between various high-level Saudi officials, many of them intelligence agents. That does not mean they were necessarily directed by something called the Saudi government, but it does mean that they were all beneficiaries of various factions in the Saudi royal family who were anxious to keep the pot boiling, who told these people to go off and do various operations, just don't do them at home. And if you want to, strike a blow for jihad, that would be very good, but just don't get us in trouble, etc. But of course, they did get them in trouble. All hell broke loose when the Twin Towers were destroyed, and U.S.-Saudi relations went into extreme crisis. But people on both sides then struggled mightily to repair the damage, and the U.S. Did its best to make sure that the old Saudi-U.S. relationship would continue undisturbed.
Mm. Now, I talked with Greg Palast way back in, 2003 or something about the FBI agents who were told back off the Saudis when Bush came in. They already had been told basically back off the Saudis, but now they were told ever even more than before to back off the Saudis. And the simple explanation was along the lines of what you just said. Half of it anyway. The Republicans' friends, and business associates were the ones. Turkey and Bandar were the ones who were paying this protection money to Al-Qaeda to just don't do attacks inside the kingdom and leave us alone, and here's your protection money, and how that would be an embarrassing relationship, and so they didn't want that exposed, and so at the risk of a terrorist attack, I guess, they told the FBI don't try so hard when it comes to these matters, and all that, and that makes a lot of sense, and I believe the story of Turkey bringing them protection money even predates the 9/11 attacks themselves. I think, that was already actually even known before that. Palast, I think, talks about a briefcase full of cash back in 96 or something. You were going to say?
Yeah, I think one really important incident is the Khobar Tower bombing in 1996, when someone drove a truck bomb into a building that was housing U.S. military personnel and exploded it and killed 19 U.S. soldiers and wounded something like 500 people. When the U.S. tried to figure out what happened, they were stonewalled by the Saudis, and eventually the Saudis told them that Iran had done it, Shiites had done it. To me, that makes no sense, but it was what the U.S. wanted to hear. So the U.S. went off and said, okay, well, now we know the Saudis are innocent. Al-Qaeda had nothing to do with it. It's all the fault of those terrible Iranians. But I think that itself was a very important cover-up, because I believe that it's really quite clear that wasn't an Al-Qaeda operation, right. Which the U.S. was really content to ignore. So that, I think, is kind of the original sin in this entire relationship.
Yeah, well, that certainly makes a lot of sense, and Gareth Porter has done great work on that, and Michael Scheuer himself has said that, it was, in fact, there's a great piece in the Village Voice by, I forget the guy's name now off the top of my head for some reason, but it's called Rudy's Ties to a Terror Sheik, and it's about the Qatari Sheik Al-Thani, Rudy Giuliani's buddy, and how he let Osama and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed stay at his place on the other side of the fence from where the Khobar Towers attack took place, actually. And they were there just in the weeks before it, etc. So, pretty
No,
clear.
This is a really important angle. And I think this really sort of marks the start of the of what a great U.S. cover-up of the CIA Al-Qaeda Saudi linkage.
Yeah. All right, but now, so back to the 28 pages in the San Diego cell, though, for a minute. Larissa says in the article, and I can't help but agree with her there, that, well, geez, this doesn't look like it's just protection money for Al-Qaeda guys. This looks like it's money for a specific operation. She doesn't leap to conclusion and say the 9/11 hijacking kamikaze attack, but she says when these guys show up and, get fake government jobs and get all this money, whatever, it seems like if you're talking about protection money for the movement, then wouldn't that money just go from Saudi through the Taliban to Osama and friends in Afghanistan? That's going to go actually to San Diego, California, USA, into the pockets and of the hijackers and the flight school people who are training them how to fly. I mean, that seems pretty damn specific for just Turkey's, here's a bag full of money, don't attack inside, Riyadh.
I don't know. It certainly does sounds pretty damning, I must say. I mean, I don't know. It's hard. The Saudis our royal family is extremely opaque. It's hard to know what's going on. It certainly doesn't look good.
I mean, I kind of go with Richard Clark's theory here a little bit because I just can't imagine that Prince Bandar's going to stab Bush Jr. right in the chest. I mean, if it comes down to he kind of ran this thing and it really was a Saudi op to do the attack run by, the people at the top, not just some private princes with a pocketbook, but Bandar in Turkey, and Bandar's father, I think too, was it Turkey's father was running the highest level thing. If they really did it, then that would certainly imply Trutherland now, where they had some kind of handshake promise deal with Bush and Rumsfeld that you promise not to nuke us if we do this for you.
It's hard to believe.
It is, but geez, I mean, they're smoking cigars hanging out on the Truman balcony 2 days later, 3 days later. So I'm living in the twilight zone here, man. What did Bandar say? Bush, I'm really sorry that I financed the hijackers who did this to you. I didn't mean to. We were trying to recruit them, but it didn't work out. Or what? And what did the FBI tell Bush about it? I'm pissed off.
I just wouldn't want to underestimate the possibility of this gross incompetence.
Me either.
Yeah, these guys have rogue agents. They have money flying all around. There are all kinds of operations that they just don't want to hear about. Okay, it's like the mafioso, the mafia. Don't tell me what you're going to do. Just go off and do it. And so everyone wants deniability. Everyone has these things, these operations happening. And in this case, one of them blew spectacularly out of hand. But I think what's clear is that the Saudi government, was implicated deeply in this. Not that it wanted the Twin Towers to be destroyed, but it was funneling money to people who were clearly working towards this end, and the Saudis didn't want to know what they were up to.
Yeah.
This is but I agree.
I'm with you. I mean, I always want to go for the simplest and least alarmist and most Occam's razor explanation first. Absolutely. There's no point in getting carried away, but at the same time, we got to do a little bit of thought experiments here. There's either this explanation or that one, or I'm afraid yours is sort of there is no explanation because no one's really watching what they're doing with this, but I'm not so sure that, Bayoumi wasn't telling Bandar what he was doing. I don't know. It's a lot of questions still. It's not a bunch of answers.
I'm open to all ideas, but it's just to change the subject slightly. Did you watch Trump's speech last night?
I'm afraid so. Yes.
That was a pretty dynamic performance, and this guy and the Obama Clinton administration is just so monumentally incompetent. They have really just screwed up so royally. Mm-hmm. They've created such a goddamn mess that Trump, was in certain perverse ways. And by the way, I'm not trying to in any way apologize for the guy or endorse him, but the guy, really put his finger on the problem, which is just gross incompetence on the top of the at the top in the top ruling circles in this country.
Yeah, he really did. He screwed up his characterization of the Iran deal and the Egypt revolution. But then, as far as Iraq, Libya, and Syria, yeah, that sure sounds right. And my thing is, too, I've always hoped that he would understand that it's good politics to hit Hillary from the left on the wars, man. Just keep doing it. And then the more he does it, the more hopefully he'll realize that it's good politics to keep taking these positions. And he's such a damn liar. It doesn't matter that he demanded the Libya war back at the time. He doesn't care. He'll just go ahead and accuse her of it anyway. And after all, what did he do to actually make the war happen compared to her, right? Nothing. So, my thing is, and of course, every time he does this, the whole establishment, the media, and everyone freaks out and attacks him as though he's the crazy one, when it's the conventional wisdom that, as we're discussing here, is completely nuts. And so, they're attacking him all day now about he doesn't want to pick a fight with Russia. Well, that's crazy. Well, keep it up and see whether the American people agree that it's crazy to not want to fight with Russia when Hillary is so determined to prove what a tough guy she is.
Look, Scott, I really don't, I'm not trying to get the administration off the hook. I think the way to understand this thing is that back in the 1980s, the U.S. entered into a very deep alliance with the Saudis. It was during the time of the Iran-Contra scandals, and the U.S. was seeking to offshore its intelligence operations. It was very similar to offshoring in the certain financial operations that Wall Street was doing at the time. So the U.S. Offshored its intelligence operations. It let the Saudis carry out its most distasteful operations, funneling arms to the Nicaraguan Contras or to UNITA in Angola, and was very grateful. And that relationship carried on, from Afghanistan into Central America and Central Africa, and then into Syria, Libya, et cetera, et cetera. So the U.S. is really bound hand and foot to the Saudis, and it's a marriage it really can't break. So that's what's going on here. So the U.S. Has to protect the Saudis. It's got to cover up for what they do. It's got to make apologies for their various mistakes and errors and misadventures. And when something really dreadful happens like 9/11, it's got to cover it up as best it can, make sure that nobody implicates the Saudis in the operation, and to the point where Bush, launched an invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq in order to draw attention away from the Saudis. It's just it's monstrous. But this is why the Middle East is in such a disaster these days, not because of what the Arab masses are doing or how what terrible Islam is up to, but because of these high-level machinations between Washington and Riyadh.
Mm-hmm. Well, we know it's the plain old black and white New York Times version of the current Yemen war is that it's to placate Saudi after the Iran deal. They feel like their position is threatened. But I wonder if you think that. Really, if you go back to Obama's interview with Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic in 2012, where they're really talking about, in a way, they're saying that, the war in Syria and getting rid of Assad is a way to kind of placate Israel and placate Saudi, because of the Iran deal. We're doing the Iran deal, which they oppose, and so we'll kind of do this as a sop to them. I wonder how much of a role you think that played in the thinking back in 2011 and 2012.
Oh, it's ever present. Look, in I think it was 2010, Obama gave a speech in Cairo, in which he talked about the need for. No, it was 2011. I'm sorry, and in the middle of the Arab Spring events, in which he talked about the need for for democracy in the Middle East, and an end to religious persecution, sectarianism, etc. Now, he talked about the importance of a Shiite being free to worship in Cairo or in North Africa or this country or that, but he said not one word about Saudi Arabia. This is a blank spot as far as the U.S. is concerned. Saudi Arabia is beyond criticism. And by the way, this is a disastrous regime, which is one of the most illiberal governments in the face of the earth. They pump out, along with the oil they pump out religious fanaticism, bigotry, and terrorism, and the U.S. Goes along. Now, and why do they go along? That's the question of the hour. And the reason they go along is their ultimate nightmare, and this is quite real. Their ultimate nightmare is the royal family will fall, and who will replace them? ISIS.
Yeah, their own Frankenstein monster that they've created
Precisely.
all this time serving them. Yep.
They are terrified that ISIS will march into Riyadh, will hang the royal family from the nearest light, street light, and will then gain control of roughly a quarter of the world's fossil fuel reserves.
Hilarious.
And believe me, it is hardly a far-fetched scenario.
Well, yeah, no, at this point, but even then, economically speaking, it doesn't mean a thing. I mean, hell, even ISIS that exists now does everything they can to pump every drop of oil they can and put it on the market and sell it to Erdogan if they can.
Yeah, but if the Saudis get a hold of, I think if ISIS gets a hold of those oil fields, they'll have a lot of money at their disposal. A lot of money.
Well, but the point is, who cares? The oil will still be for sale, so what does America care? The only reason America cares is if, in the event of some future war with China, they want to be able to make sure to shut off all the global spigots so that we have access and they don't. But that's just strategery. That doesn't have anything to do with a gallon at the pump.
Right.
So, yeah, it sure seems, in other words, as I hate to say it, as Trump might put it, a lot more expensive of a policy overall than it's worth. You know, we pay $1 trillion a year for this empire, and yet we lose on every deal that we forge with our empire. So how's that worth it? You know?
No, it's a disaster. But this is what happens. Empires march off to war. They get themselves in big trouble. I mean, in 1914, 4 or 5 of the world's greatest empires marched into war, and inside of 4 years, 11 million soldiers were dead, and 4 or 5 of the royal families were overthrown. I mean, imperialism is just an extreme crisis. It's self-destructing right now as we speak, and hell is going to break loose very shortly. And believe me, I'm a very sober person. I'm not drunk. I'm not stoned. I'm sitting here drinking a bottle of cool water. And I'm trying to be as sober as I can, but they are really faced a staring disaster straight in the face.
All right. Thanks very much for your time again on the show, Daniel. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Scott. It was great.
All right, y'all. That is Daniel Lazaire, and he's got this great new piece. Well, horrible new piece, but you got to read it anyway. It's at consortiumnews.com. U.S.-backed Syrian moderates, in scare quotes properly, behead 12-year-old. Very important piece. It's not just the news, but the rest of the piece too. Very quotable, very important, lots of great footnotes. His book is called The Frozen Republic, How the Constitution is Paralyzing Democracy.